Richard Nixon was the 37th President of the United States. Before he was elected president, he was vice president from 1953 to 1961. His presidency was from 1969 to 1974. He was involved in many amazing things. For example, Cambodia. In March 1969, President Richard Nixon authorized secret bombing raids in Cambodia. He believed that the operation was necessary as a preemptive strike to prevent North Vietnamese attacks from Cambodia. He had believed North Vietnam was transporting troops and supplies through neighboring Cambodia into South Vietnam. He hoped that by bombing supply routes in Cambodia, it would weaken the United States' enemies. The Watergate. It was a scandal that lasted from 1972 to 1974. There was evidence that members of Nixon's re-election committee broke into the Democratic National Committee's Watergate headquarters. They stole copies of top-secret documents and bugged office phones. Before he was impeached and had to go to trial, in order to prevent all of that, he decided to resign as president. Vietnam. He administered a policy called Vietnamization. It was to end the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. For example, he wanted to expand the train South Vietnamese forces, which would eventually reduce slowly the number of U.S. combat troops. China. Nixon visited China to mend relations between China and U.S. It was a step to normalize relations between the U.S. and China. Nixon visited China also to gain leverage over the Soviet Union. The EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency, was a mission to protect human and environmental health, also responsible for creating standards and laws that promote the health of individuals and the environment. Detente. A period of trying to ease tensions between the Soviet Union and the U.S. after the Cold War. This resolved in the signing of the SALT treaties. War on drugs. This was a press conference given on June 18, 1971, by Nixon. The day after publication of a special message from Nixon to the Congress on drug abuse prevention and control, during which he declared drug abuse as public enemy number one. He wanted to devote more federal resources to the prevention of new addicts and rehabilitation of those who are addicted. Jimmy Carter was the 39th President of the United States. He was president from 1977 to 1981. He was involved in many great things as well. First being the Iran hostage crisis. This lasted 444 days, from November 1979 to January 1981. Iranians were upset with the fight-tight relationship their leader, the Shah, had forged with the United States. So, on November 4, 1979, a group of Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking more than 60 American hostages. The immediate cause of this action was President Jimmy Carter's decision to allow Iran's deposed Shah, a pro-Western autocrat who had been expelled from his country some months before, to come to the United States for cancer treatment. However, the hostage-taking was about more than the Shah's medical care. It was a dramatic way for the student revolutionaries to declare a break with Iran's past and end to American interference in its affairs. The source of tension between Iran and the U.S. stemmed from an increasingly intense conflict over oil. In October 1979, President Carter agreed to allow the exiled leader to enter the U.S. for treatment of an advanced malignant lymphoma. His decision was humanitarian, not political. Americans and the rest of the world watched in horror as the events of the hostage crisis was played out on television. The blindfolded hostages were paraded for the cameras to humiliate the United States. Peace in the Middle East. On that day, in 1979, the world watched as Egyptian President Anwar Sadat Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and U.S. President Jimmy Carter gathered outside on the White House lawn for the signing of his peace accord, the first one between Israel and a neighboring Arab state. After fighting 5 times in less than 30 years, the two regional powers in the Middle East, Egypt and Israel, had, with the help of the U.S. mediation, finally made peace. In what would become an economic moment in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the three leaders at the end of the ceremony joined hands and shared broad smiles, symbolically concluding 16 months of negotiations. The peace between Egypt and Israel was a major diplomatic accomplishment, and it is one that would not have been at all possible without the tireless and heroic efforts of Jimmy Carter. During the negotiations, talks between the Egyptians and the Israelis, held on multiple occasions, was at these critical junctures when Carter personally intervened to ensure progress resumed. This task was one that Carter handled deftly given the complexity of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the political constraints he was operating under at the time. With the talks about to break down, Carter suddenly changed the United States' role so that instead of merely facilitating negotiations, the American delegation would now lead them. Whatever challenges emerged, Carter kept the parties together and managed to see the negotiations through because he worked tirelessly by playing the role of draftsman, strategist, therapist, friend, adversary, and mediator. Nonetheless, his willingness to continue negotiating a peace agreement under these difficult circumstances makes Carter an inspiring and bold leader. His accomplishment serves as a model for how American leadership can successfully be used to mediate and resolve seemingly intractable issues in the Middle East and in other parts of the world. The Camp David Peace Accords. The Camp David Peace Accords were a series of agreements signed by Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin following nearly 2 weeks of secret negotiations at Camp David, the historic country retreat of the President of the United States. The two sides were brought together by President Jimmy Carter, and the accords were signed on September 17, 1978. The landmark agreement stabilized the fractious relations between Israel and Egypt, though the long-term impact of the Camp David Accord remains up for debate. The two leaders accepted Carter's invitation, and the summit began on September 5, 1978, and lasted for 13 days. It was extremely unusual for heads of state to engage in a summit meeting at which the outcome was so much in doubt. Carter then compiled a single document that encompassed a resolution of the major issues, presented the proposals to each leader in separate meetings, assessed their comments, and redrafted the manuscript some 24 times, shuttling the manuscript back and forth for their review. This single document method became a mainstay of Carter's post-presidency work at the Carter Center to resolve international disputes. The peace treaty that Israel and Egypt signed in March 1979 closely reflected President Carter's proposals at Camp David and formally ended the state of war that had existed between the two countries. Israel agreed to withdraw from Sinai, and Egypt promised to establish normal diplomatic relations between the two countries and open the Suez Canal to Israeli ships, which until then had been banned from the waterway. These provisions were duly carried out. However, most Arab countries, rather than following Egypt's lead, ostracized Egypt and expelled it from the Arab League. On July 15, 1979, President Carter outlined his plans to reduce oil imports and improve emergency efficiency in his Crisis of Convenience speech, sometimes known as the Malaya speech. In November 1979, Iranian revolutionaries seized the American embassy and Carter imposed an embargo against Iranian oil. However, after oil prices collapsed in the mid-1980s, the prices dropped to more moderate levels, domestic oil production fell once more, while progress towards energy efficiency slowed and foreign imports increased. Malay's speech. People would have to pull together to see the country through its energy problems, Carter said, while never using the word Malays. It became known as the Malay speech, since it reflected Carter's pessimistic view of the country's direction. The political world, Carter added, was corrupt, inefficient, and evasive.